Section 1 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 11. Northern Department. General Carleton superseded. General Burgoyne vested with command for operations in Canada. Ticonderoga abandoned by General St. Clair. Affair of Fort Stanwix. Of Bennington and various other important movements of the two armies until the Convention of Saratoga. General Burgoyne repairs to England on parole. His reception there. Reflections and observations on the event of the Northern Campaign. From the time that Quebec was invested by Montgomery and Arnold at the close of the year 1775 until the termination of General Burgoyne's campaign in the autumn of 1777, these successes, the expectations, and the disappointments from that quarter had been continually varying. Sir Guy Carleton, the Governor of Canada, and who for a number of years had been Commander-in-Chief of all the British forces through that province, was an officer of approved fidelity, courage, and ability. He had successfully resisted the storm carried into that country by order of Congress. He had triumphed in the premature fall of the intrepid but unfortunate Montgomery. He had driven back the impetuous Arnold to the verge of the lakes. He had defeated the operations of General Thompson in a bold and successless attempt to surprise the British post at Trois Rivières. General Thompson was there made a prisoner, with all of his party who escaped the sword. This happened about the time a detachment was marched northward under the command of General Thomas. He died of the smallpox, as related above, when most of his army was destroyed by the sword, sickness, or flight. Though General Carleton had occasionally employed some of the Indian allies of Great Britain, he had, by his address, kept back the numerous tribes of savages near and beyond the distant lakes. He rather chose to hold them in expectation of being called to action than to encourage their ferocious inclination for war, which they ever prosecute in those horrid forms that shock humanity too much for description. Whether his checking the barbarity of the savages, or whether his lenity to the unfortunate Americans that had fallen into his hands, operated to his disadvantage, or whether from other political motives, is yet uncertain. However, he was superseded in his military capacity, and the command given to General Burgoyne, who had re-embarked from England early in the spring, and arrived at Quebec in the month of May, 1777, with a large and chosen armament. General Carleton felt the affront as a brave officer, conscious of having discharged his trust with a degree of humanity on one side, and the strictest fidelity to his master on the other. He immediately requested leave to quit the government and repair to England. Yet he did not at once desert the service of his king. His influence was too great among the Canadians and over all the Indian tribes to hazard his absence at this critical conjuncture. His return to Europe was therefore postponed. He encouraged the provincials to aid his successors, and exerted himself much more than heretofore to bring on the innumerable hordes of the wilderness. In consequence of this, they poured down from the forest in such multitudes as to awaken apprehensions in his own breast of a very disagreeable nature, but he cajoled them to some term of restraint, acted for a time in conjunction with Burgoyne, and made his arrangements in such a manner as greatly to facilitate the operations of the summer campaign. General Burgoyne was a gentleman of polite manners, literary abilities, and tried bravery, but haughty in his deportment, sanguine in opinion, and an inveterate foe to America from the beginning of the contest with Britain. This he had discovered as a member of the House of Commons, as well as in the field. On his arrival in Canada, he lost no time, but left a sufficient force for the protection of Quebec, and proceeded immediately across the lakes at the head of 8,000 or 10,000 men, including Canadians, and reached the neighborhood of Crown Point before the last of June. There, according to the barbarous system of policy adopted by his employers, though execrated by a minority in Parliament, he summoned the numerous tribes of savages to slaughter and bloodshed. A Congress of Indians was convened, who met on the western side of Lake Champlain. He gave them a war feast, and though his delicacy might not suffer him to comply with their usual custom, and taste the goblet of war by which they bind themselves to every ferocious deed, he made them a speech calculated to excite them to plunder and carnage, though it was speciously covered by some injunctions of pity towards the aged and infirm, who might experience the wretched fate of becoming their prisoners. Yet he so far regarded the laws of humanity as to advise the savages to tomahawk only such as were found in arms for the defense of their country, and gave some encouragement to their bringing in prisoners alive, instead of exercising the general massacre usual in all their conflicts. Nor would he promise a reward for the scalps of those who were killed merely to obtain the bounty. Having thus, as he supposed, secured the fidelity of savages, whom no laws of civilization can bind, when in competition with their appetite for revenge and war, he published a pompous and ridiculous proclamation. In this he exhorted the inhabitants of the country, wherever he should march, immediately to submit to the clemency of his royal master. To quicken their obedience, he ostentatiously boasted that he had but to lift his arm, and beckon by a stretch thereof the innumerable hordes of the wilderness, who stood ready to execute his will, and pour vengeance on any who should yet have the temerity to counteract the authority of the King of England. He concluded his proclamation with these memorable threats: "I trust I shall stand acquitted in the eyes of God and man, in denouncing and executing the vengeance of the state against the willful outcasts. The messengers of justice and of wrath await them in the field, and devastation, famine, and every concomitant horror that a reluctant but indispensable prosecution of military duty must occasion, will bar the way to their return." Footnote: see Burgoyne's speech to the Indians and his singular proclamation at large in the British Remembrancer, the Annual Register, and in many other authentic records. End of footnote. After these preliminary steps, General Burgoyne pushed forward with his whole force, and possessed himself of Ticonderoga without the smallest opposition. This was a strong post commanded by General St. Clair, an officer always unfortunate, and in no instance ever distinguished for bravery or judgment. Though the Americans here were inferior in numbers to the British, they were not so deficient in men as in arms, more particularly musketry and bayonets. But their works were strong, the troops healthy, and they had just received a reinforcement of men, and a fresh supply of everything else necessary for defense. In these circumstances, there could scarcely be found a sufficient excuse for calling a hasty council of war, and drawing off by might 5,000 or 6,000 men on the first approach of the enemy. The want of small arms was the only plausible pretense offered by the commander to justify his conduct. This deficiency St. Clair must have known before the 5th of July, when he in a fright fled with his whole army and left everything standing in the garrison. Footnote: about this time, a misfortune befell the Americans not far distant from Montreal, at a place called the Cedars. There, Major Butterfield, with his party, were compelled to surrender prisoners of war. This party, captured by Captain Forster, who commanded the British, consisted of 400 or 500 men. It was warmly disputed afterwards between Congress and the British commanders whether the Cedars men, who were permitted to depart on parole, should be exchanged for British prisoners taken under Burgoyne. End of footnote. It is not probable the Americans could have long kept their ground against the superiority of the British officers and the number and discipline of their troops, yet undoubtedly measures might have been early taken by a judicious commander to have retreated if necessary, without so much disgrace, and the total loss of their artillery, stores, provisions, their shipping on the lake, and many valuable lives. The order for retreat was unexpected to the army. They had scarce time to secure a part of their baggage. The flight was rapid, and the pursuit vigorous. The soldiers having lost all confidence in their commander, the outposts were everywhere evacuated, and a general dismay pervaded the fugitives, who, in scattered parties, were routed in every quarter and driven naked into the woods. After 2 days wandering in the wilderness, the largest body of the Americans who had kept together were overtaken and obliged to make a stand against a party that much outnumbered them, commanded by Colonel Fraser, who had been indefatigable in the pursuit. The action continued 3 or 4 hours, when the Americans, though they fought with bravery, were totally routed with very great loss. Colonel Francis, the gallant commander of this party, was killed, with many other officers of merit. 200 or 300 privates were left dead on the field, thrice that number wounded or taken prisoners. Most of the wounded perished miserably in the woods. The British lost several officers highly esteemed by them, among whom was Major Grant, a man of decided bravery. Yet General Burgoyne found to his cost his incapacity to execute the boast he had some time before made in the House of Commons, that so little was to be apprehended from the resistance of the colonies, that he would engage to drive the continent with 500 disciplined troops. General St. Clair had made good his own retreat so far as to be 6 miles ahead with the van of the routed army. Such was his terror on hearing of the defeat of Colonel Francis and some other successes of the Royal Army, that instead of proceeding to Fort Anne, as intended, he shrunk off into the woods, uncertain where to fly for security. Another party of the Americans who had reached Fort Anne were attacked and reduced by Colonel Hill, with 1 British regiment. They set fire to the fortress themselves to prevent its falling into the hands of the victors, and fled with the utmost speed towards Fort Edward on the Hudson. General St. Clair and the miserable remains of his army, who escaped death, either by fatigue or the sword, after a march of 7 days through mountainous and unfrequented passages, harassed in the rear, and almost without provisions of any kind, arrived at Fort Edward in a most pitiable condition. General Burgoyne was too much the experienced officer to neglect his advantages. He pushed forward with equal alacrity and success, and in spite of the embarrassments of bad roads, mountains, thickets, and swamps, he reached the neighborhood of Fort Edward within a few days after the broken remnant of St. Clair's army had posted themselves there. On his approach, the Americans immediately decamped from Fort Edward under the command of General Schuyler, whom they found there, and withdrew to Saratoga. He had been making some efforts to collect the militia from the country contiguous to aid and support the routed corps, but on their advance he did not think it prudent to face the British troops. End of section 1. Section 2 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 11, Part 2. A share of the public odium on this occasion fell on General Schuyler. His conduct, as well as the delinquency of General St. Clair, was very heavily censured. They were both ordered, with some other of the principal officers of the late Council of War at Ticonderoga, to repair to Congress to answer for the loss of that fort, and the command of the Lake Champlain. On the other hand, it was no small triumph to General Burgoyne and his army, thus to have chased the Americans from the province of Canada, to find themselves in possession of all the lakes, and to see the British standard erected on the Hudson, which had long been an object of importance with administration. Exaggerated accounts of the weakness of the Americans, the incapacity of their officers, and the timidity of the troops were transmitted to England, and the most sanguine expectations formed by people of every description through the island. They were ready to imagine that hunted from post to post, both in the northern and southern departments, the spirits of the colonists must be broken, their resources fail, and that the United States, thus repeatedly disappointed, would lose all energy of opposition, and soon fall a prey to the pride and power of Great Britain. But notwithstanding the unhappy derangement of their affairs at the northward, and the successes of General Howe at the southward, there appeared not the smallest inclination among the people at large, throughout the American states, to submit to royal authority. The untoward circumstances that had taken place neither exhausted their hopes nor damped the ardor of enterprise. The dangers that lowered in every quarter seemed rather to invigorate the public mind and quicken the operations of war. On the defeat of St. Clair and the advance of the British Army, the Eastern States immediately drafted large detachments of militia and hastened them forward. Congress directed General Washington to appoint proper officers to repair to Saratoga and take the command. They also appointed a court of inquiry to take cognizance of the delinquency of the suspended officers, but their influence was too great with the commander-in-chief and some principal members of Congress to subject them to that measure of degradation which it was generally thought they deserved. They were dismissed, though not with approbation, yet without any severe censure, but as the conduct of St. Clair was disgraceful, and that of Schuyler could not be justified, they were neither of them appointed to active service. General Gates, a brave and experienced officer formerly in British service, a man of open manners, integrity of heart, and undisguised Republican principles, was vested with the chief command to act against Burgoyne. On his arrival at Saratoga, he drew back the army and encamped at a place called Stillwater, where he could more conveniently observe the motions of Colonel St. Leger, who was advancing to the Mohawk River to invest Fort Stanwix. This post was commanded by Colonel Gansevoort, whose bravery and intrepidity did honor to himself and to his country. General Arnold was sent on with a reinforcement from the Continental Army and a large train of artillery to the aid of General Gates. He was ordered to leave the main body and march with a detachment towards the Mohawk River to the assistance of Gansevoort. But before there was time sufficient for his relief from any quarter, this gallant officer found himself and the garrison surrounded by a large body of British troops, in conjunction with the formidable appearance of savages, yelling in the environs and thirsting for blood. At the same time, he was threatened by their more enlightened, yet not more humanized allies, that unless he immediately surrendered the garrison, or if he delayed until it was taken by storm, they should all be given up to the fury of the Indians, who were bent upon the massacre of every officer and soldier. St. Leger, by letters, messages, and all possible methods, endeavored to intimidate the commander of the fortress. He observed that the savages were determined to wreak their vengeance for the recent loss of some of their chiefs on the inhabitants of the Mohawk River, and to sweep the young plantations there without distinction of age or sex. He made an exaggerated display of his own strength, of power and success of Burgoyne, and the hopeless state of the garrison, unless by a timely submission they put themselves under his protection. On this condition, he promised to endeavor to mitigate the barbarity of his Indian coadjutors, and to soften the horrors usually attendant on their victories. Colonel Gansevoort, instead of listening to any proposals of surrender, replied that entrusted by the United States with the charge of the garrison, he should defend it to the last extremity, regardless of the consequences of his doing his duty. Their danger was greatly enhanced by the misfortune of General Herkimer, who had marched for the relief of Fort Stanwix, but with too little precaution. At the head of 800 or 900 militia, he fell into an ambuscade, consisting mostly of Indians, and notwithstanding a manly defense, few of them escaped. They were surrounded, routed, and butchered in all the barbarous shapes of savage brutality, after many of them had become their prisoners, and their scalps carried to their British allies to receive the stipulated price. A vigorous sally from the garrison, conducted by Colonel Willett of New York, and his successful return with a number of prisoners, gave the first information of the failure of Herkimer. This, instead of discouraging, inspirited to fresh enterprise. The valiant Willett, in contempt of danger and difficulty, hazarded a passage by night through the enemy's works, and traversed the unexplored and pathless wilderness for upwards of 50 miles to the more inhabited settlements, in order to raise the country to hasten to the relief of the garrison and the protection of the inhabitants scattered along the borders of the Mohawk River. General Arnold had marched with 1,000 men for the relief of the besieged, but though in his usual character he made all possible dispatch, the gallant Gansevoort had 2 days before his arrival repulsed the assailants and obliged them to retreat in such disorder that it had all the appearance of a flight. In consequence of this, St. Leger was obliged to relinquish the siege with so much precipitation that they left their tents, stores, and artillery behind them, and their camp kettles on the fire. This movement was hurried on by the sullen and untractable behavior of the Indians, which rose to such a height as to give him reason to be apprehensive for his own safety. His fears were well founded. Their conduct had become so outrageous that it was not in the power of Sir John Johnson, Butler, and other influential friends of the savages to keep them within any bounds. They frequently plundered the baggage of the British officers, and when an opportunity offered the slightest advantage, they murdered their British or German allies with the same brutal ferocity with which they imbrued their hands in the blood of Americans. The next movement of importance made by General Burgoyne was an attempt to get possession of the little obscure town of Bennington, lying in the Hampshire Grants among the Green Mountains, and made considerable only by the deposit of a large quantity of cattle, provisions, carriages, and other necessaries for the use of the American army. For the purpose of seizing these, as well as to intimidate the people in that quarter, by the magnitude of his power and the extent of his designs, he detached a party of Hessians, with a few loyalists and some Indians, to the amount of 1,500, and gave the command to Colonel Baum, a German officer. He was commissioned, after he had surprised Bennington, to ravage the adjacent country, and if possible to persuade the inhabitants that he was in force sufficient, and that he designed to march on to Connecticut River in the road to Boston. He was ordered to inform them that the main body of the British army was in motion for the same purpose, that they were to be joined at Springfield by a detachment from Rhode Island, and that by their irresistible power they meant to bring the rebellious Americans to due submission, or to sweep the whole country. Footnote: General Burgoyne's instructions to Lieutenant Colonel Baum. The object of your expedition is to try the affection of the country, to disconcert the counsels of the enemy, to mount the Rydesville Dragoons, to complete Petrie's Corps, and to obtain large supplies of cattle, horses, and carriages. The several corps, of which the enclosed is a list, are to be under your command. The troops must take no tents, and what little baggage is carried by the officers must be on their own battalion horses. You are to proceed from Battenkill to Arlington, and take post there till the detachment of the provincials under the command of Captain Sherwood shall join you, from the southward. You are then to proceed to Manchester, where you will again take post, so as to secure the pass of the mountains. On the road from Manchester to Rockingham, from thence you will detach the Indians and light troops to the northward, towards Otter Creek. On their return, and receiving intelligence that no enemy is upon the Connecticut River, you will proceed by the road over the mountains to Rockingham, where you will take post. This will be the most distant part of the expedition, and must be proceeded upon with caution, as you will have the defiles of the mountains behind you, which might make a retreat difficult. You must therefore endeavor to be well informed of the force of the enemy's militia in the neighboring country. Should you find it may with prudence be effected, you are to remain there while the Indians and light troops are detached up the river, and you are afterwards to descend the river to Brattleboro, and from that place, by the quickest march, you are to return by the great road to Albany. During your whole progress, your detachments are to have orders to bring in to you all horses fit to mount the dragoons under your command, or to serve as battalion horses for the troops, together with as many saddles and bridles as can be found. The number of horses requisite, besides those necessary for mounting the regiment of dragoons, ought to be 1,300. If you can bring more, for the use of the army, it will be so much the better. Your parties are likewise to bring in wagons and other convenient carriages, with as many draft oxen as will be necessary to draw them, and all cattle fit for slaughter, milch cows excepted, which are to be left for the use of the inhabitants. Regular receipts in the form heretofore subjoined are to be given in all places where any of the above articles are taken, to such persons as have remained in their habitations, and otherwise complied with the terms of General Burgoyne's manifesto, but no receipt to be given to such as are known to be acting in the service of the rebels. As you will have with you persons perfectly acquainted with the country, it may perhaps be advisable to tax the several districts with the portions of the several articles, and limit the hours for the delivery, and should you find it necessary to move before such delivery can be made, hostages of the most respectable people should be taken to secure their following you the next day. All possible means are to be used to prevent plundering, as it is probable that Captain Sherwood, who is already detached to the southward, and will join you at Arlington, will drive a considerable quantity of cattle and horses to you. You will therefore send in these cattle to the army with a proper detachment from Petrie's corps, to cover them in order to disencumber yourself. But you must always keep the regiment of dragoons compact. The dragoons themselves must ride, and take care of the horses of the regiment. Those horses that are destined for the use of the army must be tied in strings of 10 each, in order that one man may lead 10 horses. You will give the unarmed men of Petrie's corps to conduct them, and inhabitants whom you can trust. You must always keep your camps in good position, but at the same time where there is pasture, and you must have a chain of sentinels around your cattle when grazing. Colonel Skene will be with you as much as possible in order to distinguish the good subjects from the bad, to procure the best intelligence of the enemy, and choose those people who are to bring me the accounts of your progress and success. When you find it necessary to halt a day or two, you must always entrench the camp of the regiment of dragoons, in order never to risk an attack or affront from the enemy. As you will return with the regiment of dragoons mounted, you must always have a detachment of Captain Fraser's or Petrie's corps in front of the column, and the same in the rear, in order to prevent your falling into an ambuscade when you march through the woods. You will use all possible means to make the country believe that the troops under your command are the advance corps of the army, and that it is intended to pass to Connecticut on the road to Boston. You will likewise insinuate that the main army from Albany is to be joined at Springfield by a corps of troops from Rhode Island. It is highly probable that the corps under Mr. Warner, now supposed to be at Manchester, will retreat before you. But should they, contrary to expectation, be able to collect in great force and post themselves advantageously, it is left to your discretion to attack them or not, always bearing in mind that your corps is too valuable to let any considerable loss be hazarded on this occasion. Should any corps be moved from Mr. Arnold's main army in order to interrupt your retreat, you are to take as strong a post as the country will afford, and send the quickest intelligence to me, and you may depend on my making such movements as shall put the enemy between two fires, or otherwise effectually sustain you. It is imagined the progress of the whole of this expedition may be effected in about a fortnight, but every movement of it must depend on your success in obtaining such supplies of provisions as will enable you to subsist for your return in this army, in case you can get no more. And should not the army be able to reach Albany before your expedition should be completed, I will find means to send you notice of it, and give your route another direction. All persons acting in committees or any offices under the direction of the Congress, either civil or military, to be made prisoners. I heartily wish you success, and have the honor to be, sir, your humble servant, John Burgoyne, Lieutenant General, Headquarters, August 9th, 1777. End of footnote. It is astonishing that a man of General Burgoyne's understanding and military experience should issue orders so absurd and impracticable. He must have been very little acquainted with the geography of the country, and less with the spirit of the inhabitants, to have supposed that a detachment of 1,500 men could march from Saratoga till they reached Connecticut River, take post at a variety of places, levying taxes on the inhabitants, making demands of provisions, cattle, and other necessaries for the use of his army, without any resistance, thence to proceed down the river to Brattleboro, and to return by another road, and take post at Albany, and this business to be completed in the short term of a fortnight. Nor did he discover less ignorance if he expected that a detachment was to leave Rhode Island, and march through the country to Springfield on the same design, and from thence to meet Colonel Baum at Albany. End of section 2. Section 3 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 11, Part 3. It is impossible to suppose that so renowned a commander as General Burgoyne could mean to deceive or embarrass his officers by his orders, but if he flattered himself that they could be executed, he must still have cherished the opinion that he once uttered in the House of Commons, that 4,000 or 5,000 British troops could march through the continent and reduce the rebellious states to a due submission to the authority of Parliament. In this march, Burgoyne ordered all acting in committees or in any other capacity under the direction of Congress to be made prisoners. These pompous orders and bombastic threats were far from spreading the alarm and panic they were designed to excite. The adjacent country was immediately in motion, and all seemed animated with the boldest resolution in defense of the rights of nature and the peaceable possession of life and property. When Colonel Baum had arrived within 4 miles of Bennington, appearances gave him reason to apprehend that he was not sufficiently strong to make an attack on the place. Each judged it more prudent to take post on a branch of the river Hoosick, and by express inform General Burgoyne of his situation and the apparent difficulty of executing his orders with only 1,500 men. In consequence of this information, an additional party, principally Waldeckers, was sent on under the command of Colonel Breyman, But before he could surmount the unavoidable impediments emerging over bad and unfrequented roads and reach the camp of his friends and his countrymen, a body of militia commanded by General Starks had pressed forward, attacked, routed, and totally defeated Colonel Baum in the neighborhood of Bennington. General Starks in his early youth had been used to the alarm of war. His birthplace was on the borders of New Hampshire, which had been long subject to the incursions of the savages. When a child, he was captured by them and adopted as one of their own, but after a few years restored. He led a regiment to the field in 1775 and distinguished himself as a soldier. On the new arrangement of the army, he retired as a citizen. His manners were plain, honest, and severe, excellently calculated for the benefit of society in the private walks of life. But as a man of principle, he again left the occupation of the husbandman when his country was in danger. On Burgoyne's approach, he voluntarily marched to the state of Vermont at the head of the militia and immortalized his name by a signal success at Bennington in one of the darkest periods of the American War. Bennington, the present scene of action, was the first settlement in the territory of Vermont, which was as recent as the year 1769. This was made by the possessors of the tracts called the New Hampshire Grants, a robust and hardy set of men, collected from the borders and under the jurisdiction of the provinces of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. Rough, bold, and independent, these people, generally denominated the Green Mountain Boys, were brave and active, not only in the present conflict, but were eminently useful to their country by their intrepidity and valor to the conclusion of the American War. Footnote: General Burgoyne observed in a letter to Lord George Germain that the Hampshire Grants, almost unknown in the last war, now abound in the most active and most rebellious race on the continent, and hang like a gathering storm upon my left. It was several years after the Confederation of the 13 American states before Vermont was added to the Union. The inhabitants kept up a long and severe altercation with the several governments who claimed both territory and authority, until on the point of decision by the sword, both parties appealed to the General Congress. This was a business that divided and embarrassed, and was not terminated until the agents of Britain interfered and offered advantageous terms to the Vermontese if they would withdraw from the Confederated States and become a province of Britain. From their love of liberty and their attachment to their country, these offers were rejected, though they complained heavily of the delays and evasions of the Congress. Rough as their native mountains, and strong and flinty as the rocks that surrounded them, they bid defiance to dangers, and equally despised the intrigues of Britain, the subterfuges of the claimants on their territory, and the suspension in which they were held for a time by Congress. They resisted obstinately the interferences and the claims of the neighboring governments, their alienation from them, and their hatred to the state of New York in particular, daily increased, and in spite of all opposition, they continued their claims and supported their rights to be considered a free, independent, and separate state, entitled to the same privileges as the 13 old colonies. Colonel Ethan Allen, one of their principal leaders, a man of courage and ferocity, a pride without dignity, a writer without learning, a man of consequence merely from a bold, presumptive claim to a capacity for everything, without education, and possessed of little intrinsic merit, wrote to Congress on this occasion and observed that Vermont has an indubitable right to agree to terms of a cessation of hostilities with Great Britain, provided the United States persist in the rejection of her application for a union with them, but not disposed to yield to the overtures of the British government, he added. I am as resolutely determined to defend the independence of Vermont as Congress are that of the United States, and rather than fail, will retire with hardy Green Mountain boys into the desolate caverns of the mountains and wage war with human nature at large. After long suspension and many impediments, Congress thought proper, in order to prevent the effusion of blood among themselves, which this occasion threatened, to accede to the reasonable demands of these legitimate sons of freedom, who chose delegates for Congress, maintained their independence, and were a strong link in the confederated chain against the encroachments in the power of Britain. End of footnote. Governor Skene, a singular character, who had been a colonel in one of the king's regiments, had obtained a commission from the crown to act as governor at and about Lake Champlain, had assumed a jurisdiction over the Hampshire grants, and acted as companion and guide to Colonel Baum in the expedition. He fled on the first appearance of danger, as did the Loyalists, the Canadian provincials, and the Indians. Baum was wounded and taken prisoner, and his whole corps captured by this small body of American militia. Colonel Brayman, who arrived in the afternoon of the same day, escaped a similar fate only by flight, after a short and brave defense, and the loss of most of his men. This memorable event would perhaps at any other period have appeared of less moment, but when so renowned a commander as General Burgoyne, in the zenith of success and the pride of victory, was threatening with the aid of his savage adherents to execute all the deeds of horror, and joined by his employers, a repulse from so unexpected a quarter was humiliating indeed. It gave a new turn to the face of the campaign. The success at Bennington took place on the 16th of August, 1777. On the first rumor of this action through the country, the Loyalists, who in great numbers still resided among the opposers of royal authority, affected everywhere to cast over it the shade of ridicule. They alleged that the Royal Militia of Hampshire, and Starks their commander, must have been too much awed by the name and prowess of General Burgoyne and his experienced veterans to attempt anything of consequence, nor were they convinced of the truth of the report until they saw the prisoners on their way to Boston. But the people at large, who appeared to have been waiting with a kind of enthusiastic expectation for some fortunate event that might give a spring to action, at once gave full credit to the account, and magnified this success in strains of the highest exultation and defiance, and in the warmth of imagination anticipated new victories. It is certain that from this moment fortune seemed to have changed her face. Whether the spirits of the British officers and troops flagged in equal proportion as the enthusiasm for glory and victory seemed to rekindle in the bosoms of their antagonists, or whether General Burgoyne was restricted by orders that obliged him in some instances to act against his own better informed judgment, his success terminated with the capture of Fort Edward. By some of his letters written soon after this to the minister of the American Department, the situation of the British Army began to appear to General Burgoyne exceedingly critical. He intimated his apprehensions, and with an air of despondency, in one of them he observed that circumstances might require that he and the army should be devoted, and that his orders were so peremptory that he did not think himself authorized to call a council of war with regard to his present movements. It was doubtless thought necessary at all hazards to prevent the forces under General Gates from being at leisure to join General Washington. It was also a favorite point with the ministry that Burgoyne should push on to Albany, but however dubious the prospect might then appear to himself, or whatever might be his own expectations, General Burgoyne thought proper to pass the Hudson, and about the middle of September he encamped on the heights and plains of Saratoga. Supported by a number of brave, experienced, and most approved officers in British service, a large armament of British, Hessians, and provincials, with a prodigious train of artillery, and his copper-colored scouts and allies, He, with all industry, prepared to offer battle and try the fortune of war in a general engagement. The Americans, in equal readiness for action, marched from their camp on the 19th, and in a place called Stillwater, attacked the right wing of the British Army, commanded by Burgoyne himself. Meeting a repulse, they turned their whole force to the left, commanded by the Baron Riedesel, and supported by General Phillips at the head of a formidable artillery. The Americans sustained the combat for several hours against officers of distinguished bravery and more experience than themselves, who commanded some of the best troops the princes of Germany or even the monarch of Britain could boast. But evening advancing without decided advantage, the loss of men being nearly equal on both sides, the Americans retreated and recovered their camp with little interruption. The British troops lay on their arms through the night, and in the morning took an advantageous position, and spread themselves along a meadow, in full view, and almost within cannon shot of the American camp. Here General Burgoyne received intelligence from Sir Henry Clinton that he had embarked for the North River, with several thousand troops in order to make a diversion in his favor that might greatly facilitate his operations. This account flattered the former expectations of Burgoyne, who judged that General Gates would be obliged to divide his army to succor the distressed villages on each side the Hudson, now exposed to the most cruel ravages. Expectation was again raised, and the British army invigorated by fresh hopes that a junction at Albany might soon be effected. With these ideas, General Burgoyne found means to dispatch several messages by private ways through the woods to General Clinton. The purport of these was that, if possible to remain unmolested, he should keep his present position a few days longer, when probably the American army might be weakened by the necessity of detachments for other service. He was further strengthened in the ideas of success by a recent disappointment of the Americans in an attempt to recover Ticonderoga. Had this enterprise succeeded, it would at once effectually have prevented the retreat of the British army, which began to be contemplated. The business was principally committed to the direction of General Lincoln, and prosecuted with vigor by the Colonels Brown, Johnson, Woodbury, and other spirited officers. They passed the mountains between Skenesborough and Lake George in so rapid and private a manner that before any intimation of the business was disseminated, they seized the outposts, captured the armed vessels and a number of boats on the lake, and with 4 companies of foot and a party of Canadians, they took possession of Mount Independence and summoned the garrison in Ticonderoga to surrender. This was gallantly refused, and the fortress bravely defended by Brigadier General Powell. The Americans made several efforts to storm the garrison, but repulsed with resolution and valor, they found themselves not in force sufficient for farther trial, and after a few days they relinquished the design and retired. End of section 3. Section 4 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 11, Part 4. Yet notwithstanding the rebuff and retreat from Ticonderoga, with the advantages the British affected to claim from the action at Stillwater, and the flattering encouragement received from Sir Henry Clinton, General Burgoyne was still involved in complicated difficulties. The dangers he had to encounter increased on every side. Fresh troops of militia were continually reinforcing the army of his enemies, while his own daily lessened by the desertion of the Canadian militia, the provincial loyalists, and the defection of the Indians. These last grew sullen from the disappointment of plunder and were irritated from the notice General Burgoyne was obliged in honor to take of the barbarous murder of a Miss McCrae, on which many of them drew off in disgust. This beautiful young lady, dressed in her bridal habiliments, in order to be married the same evening to an officer of character in Burgoyne's own regiment, while her heart glowed in expectation of a speedy union with the beloved object of her affections, was induced to leave a house near Fort Edward with the idea of being escorted to the present residence of her intended husband, and was massacred on the way, in all the cold-blooded ferocity of savage manners. Her father had uniformly been a zealous loyalist, but it was not always in the power of the most humane of the British officers to protect the innocent from the barbarity of their savage friends. General Burgoyne was shocked by the tragic circumstances that attended the fate of this lovely, unfortunate girl, but he attempted to palliate the crime, though he did not neglect an endeavor to inflict due punishment on the perpetrators. Yet such was the temper of his Indian adherents, that instead of inflicting death, he was obliged to pardon the guilty chiefs, notwithstanding the cry of justice and the grief and resentment of her lover. Footnote: the Earl of Harrington observed in evidence on Burgoyne's trial that it was his opinion and that of other officers that when General Burgoyne threatened the culprit with death and insisted that he should be delivered up, that it might have been attended with dangerous consequences. Many gentlemen of the army, besides himself, believed that motives of policy alone prevented him from putting this threat in execution, and that if he had not pardoned the murderer, which he did, the total defection of the Indians would have ensued. He observed that the consequences on their return through Canada might have been dreadful, not to speak of the weight they would have thrown into the opposite scale, had they gone over to the enemy, which I rather imagine would have been the case. The best coloring that could be given the affecting tale was that two of the principal warriors, under a pretense of guarding her person, had, in a mad quarrel between themselves, which was best entitled to the prize or to the honor of the escort, made the blooming beauty, shivering in the distress of innocence, youth, and despair, the victim of their fury. The helpless maid was butchered and scalped, and her bleeding corpse left in the woods to excite the tear of every beholder. In addition to the complicated embarrassments the British commander had to conflict, provisions grew short in the camp. He was obliged to lessen their rations and put his soldiers on allowance. The most he could hope, as he observed himself in a letter to Sir Henry Clinton, was to hold out to the 12th of October, or effect a retreat before in the best possible manner. The last expedient he soon found impracticable, by the precaution taken by General Gates to guard all the passes, to cut off all supplies, and nearly to surround the British army. In this uncertain and distressed situation, General Burgoyne waited with all the anxiety of a faithful servant, and the caution and vigilance of an able commander, from the action on the 19th of September until the 7th of October, without any nearer prospect of a diversion in his favor. He then found it necessary to make a general movement, either to decide the fate of his brave officers and men in the field of battle by a general engagement or force a retreat. General Gates equally prepared either for attack or defense. A warm engagement ensued, which proved fatal to many of the best officers in the British line. But after a sharp conflict of several hours, and the highest exhibitions of military prowess, the British found it necessary to recover their camp before evening, which they did in some disorder. They had scarcely entered it when it was stormed on every side. Lord Balcarras, with his light infantry, and a part of the British line, were ordered to throw themselves into the entrenchments, which they executed with spirit, and made a gallant and resolute defense. But the action led on by the ardent and undaunted Arnold, who acquitted himself with his usual intrepidity, was vigorously pushed in spite of the most valiant opposition, until almost in the moment of victory. Arnold was dangerously wounded, and his party obliged to retreat. The Americans were fortunate enough to carry the entrenchments of the German reserve, commanded by Colonel Bremen, who was killed in the engagement. All the artillery and equipage of the brigade and about 200 officers and privates were captured. The engagement was continued through the whole of this fated day, which closed the scene of conflict and mortality on many brave men, and a number of officers of distinguished valor. The first in name who fell was Brigadier General Fraser. Before his death, General Fraser requested that his body might be carried to his grave by the field officers of his own corps, without any parade, and buried there. About sunset, the body was brought up the hill, attended only by the officers of his own family. They passed in view of the greatest part of both armies. Struck with the humility of the scene, some of the first officers of the army joined the procession, as it were from a natural propensity to pay the last attention to his remains. The incessant cannonade during the solemnity, the steady attitude and unaltered voice of the chaplain, though covered with the dust, which the shot threw up on all sides, the mute but expressive sensibility on every countenance, the growing duskiness of the evening added to the scenery, combined to mark a character and to furnish the finest subject for the pencil of a master that any field has exhibited. Footnote, extracted from a letter of General Burgoyne. End of footnote. Colonel Bremen and Sir James Clark, aide-de-camp to General Burgoyne, were also killed. Major Ackland was dangerously wounded and taken prisoner. Lady Ackland, whose conjugal affection had led her to accompany her husband through all the dangers and fatigues of a campaign in the wilderness, was a woman of the most delicate frame, of the genteelest manners, habituated to all the soft elegancies and refined enjoyments that attend high birth and fortune. Her sufferings exhibit a story so affecting to the mind of sensibility that it may apologize for a short interlude in the most interesting detail of military transactions. She had accompanied Major Ackland to Canada in 1776, after which she traversed a vast wooded country, in the most extreme seasons, to visit her husband sick in a poor hut at Chambly. On the opening of the campaign of 1777, the positive injunction of her husband prevented her risking the hazard expected before Ticonderoga. There Major Ackland was badly wounded, on which she crossed the Champlain to attend him. She followed his fortune and shared his fatigues. Through the dreary way to Fort Edward, they lodged in a miserable tent, which by accident took fire by night, when both Major Ackland and herself were saved by an orderly sergeant, who dragged them from the flames almost before they awakened. Lady Ackland lost not her resolution or her cheerfulness by the danger she had encountered, but accompanied her soldier to the action on the 19th of September. By his order, she had followed the route of the artillery and baggage, where she would be least exposed, until she alighted at a small uninhabited tent, which, when the action became general, the surgeons took possession of to dress their wounded. Thus, within hearing of the roar of cannon, when she knew the situation of her beloved husband was in the most exposed part of the action, she waited some hours in a situation and in apprehensions not easily described. The Baroness of Riedesel and the wives of the Majors Harnage and Raynell were with her, but she derived little comfort from their presence. Major Harnage was soon brought into the tent dangerously wounded, accompanied with the tidings of the death of the husband of Mrs. Raynell. Let imagination paint the misery of this little group of distressed females. Here among the wounded and the dying, Lady Ackland, with her usual serenity, stood prepared for new trials, until the fatal 7th of October, when her fortitude was put to the severest test by the intelligence that the British army was defeated, and that Major Ackland was desperately wounded and taken prisoner. Not borne down by grief or anxiety, she the next day requested leave to attend the wounded prisoner to the last moment of his life. General Burgoyne, from whose narrative some circumstances of Lady Ackland's story are selected, observes that though he had experienced that patience and fortitude in a supreme degree were to be found, as well as every other virtue, under the most tender forms, he was astonished at this proposal, after so long an exposure and agitation of the spirits, exhausted not only for want of rest, but absolutely for want of food, drenched in rain for 12 hours together, that a woman should be capable of delivering herself to the enemy, probably in the night, and uncertain what hands she should fall into, appeared an effort above human nature. He adds, he had not a cup of wine to offer her. All with which the hapless lady could be furnished was a little rum and dirty water, an open boat, and a few lines to General Gates. Thus this lady left the British lines attended only by Mr. Brudenell, chaplain to the artillery, the major's valet de chambre, and one female servant. She was rowed down the river to meet the enemy, when her distresses thickened anew. The night advanced before she met the outposts. The sentinel would neither let the boat pass nor let the passengers come on shore. Notwithstanding the singular state of this heroic lady was pathetically represented by Mr. Brudenell. Apprehensive of treachery, the sentinel threatened to fire into the boat if they attempted to stir until the appearance of day. Thus, through a dark and cold night, far advanced in a state that always requires peculiar tenderness to the sex, with a heart full of anxiety for her wounded husband, she was obliged to submit, and in this perilous situation to reflect until the dawn of the morning on her own wretched condition, and the uncertainty of what reception she should meet from strangers in hostile array. Flushed with victory, and eager to complete the triumph of the preceding day. When General Gates in the morning was made acquainted with the situation and request of Lady Ackland, she was immediately permitted to visit her husband under a safe escort. The American commander himself treated her with the tenderness of a parent, and gave orders that every attention should be paid due to her rank, her sex, her character, and the delicacy of her person and circumstances. Footnote. The afflictions of this extraordinary lady did not terminate in America. By the assiduity of the physicians and the tender care of a most affectionate wife, Major Ackland partially recovered from his wounds in a short time, and was permitted to repair to New York. It was not long before his health was sufficiently restored to embark for England, but his wounds incurable, and his mind depressed. He was led to habits of intemperance that soon put a period to his life. The death of her husband, and the domestic afflictions of the family of Lord Ilchester, the father of Lady Ackland, all combined to overpower the heroism of a mind superior to most of her sex, and involved this unfortunate lady in a deep and irretrievable melancholy. End of footnote. He wrote General Burgoyne and assured him of her safety and accommodation, and informed him that this line of conduct would have been observed without a letter from the British commander not only to this lady, but to others of his unfortunate friends languishing under their wounds, that the American commanders needed not a request to excite their humanity to the unfortunate, who, by the chances of war, had been thrown on their compassion. In the same letter, he reminded General Burgoyne that the cruelties which marked the late effort for the retreat of his army were almost without a precedent among civilized nations, and that an endeavor to ruin, where they could not conquer, betrayed more the vindictive spirit of the monk than the generosity of the soldier. But it was not always in the power of the most humane of the British officers. Footnote. General Gates' letter to General Burgoyne, August 10th, 1777. End of section 4. Section 5 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 11, Part 5. Notwithstanding the misfortunes and the losses of the preceding day, General Burgoyne did not yet totally despair of retrieving his affairs and his honor by another general engagement. This he endeavored to effect on the 8th, and in this he was again disappointed. The utmost bravery was exhibited on both sides, but no decided action. Several days passed on in desultory skirmishes. Spirit and intrepidity were not wanting on either side, while the one had everything to hope and inspirit them, the other nothing left but a choice of insurmountable difficulties. In this situation, the British commander judged the best expedient was a second effort to repass the Hudson and retreat to Fort Edward. To this every impediment was thrown in his way. A retreat was rendered impracticable by the number and vigilance of the Americans. The borders of the river were lined with troops, and detachments pushed forward to cut off all hope of retreat on every side. The condition of the British army grew hourly more desperate. Winter was approaching, their provisions spent, the troops exhausted by continual fatigue, and not the smallest prospect of relief appeared from any quarter. In this deplorable situation, General Burgoyne summoned a grand council of war, in which, as he stood in need of every advice, not only the field officers but the subalterns had a voice. It was unanimously judged most prudent, in the humiliated and hopeless condition to which they were reduced, to open a treaty of convention and endeavor to obtain some honorable terms of surrender. General Gates was acknowledged by all, not only the valiant, but the humane and generous foe. They had no doubt he would mitigate their mortification, as far as the laws of war or of honor would permit, from the victor to the vanquished. In consequence of this determination, the solemn negotiation took place on the 13th of October. General Burgoyne intimated to the American commander that he wished to send a field officer to him to confer on matters of the highest moment, and requested to know when he might be received. General Gates really possessed that humanity which distinguishes the hero from the assassinator of the feelings of wounded honor. He seemed touched by the request, with that sympathy which ever resides in the bosom of generosity, and replied instantly that an officer from General Burgoyne should be received at the advanced post of the Army of the United States at 10 o'clock the next morning. Major Kingston was accordingly sent at the appointed time, and was conducted to the headquarters of the American Army. The purport of the message was that Lieutenant General Burgoyne, having twice fought General Gates, had determined on a third conflict, but well apprised of the superiority of numbers and the disposition of the American troops, he was convinced that either a battle or a retreat would be a scene of carnage on both sides. In this situation he was impelled by humanity, and thought himself justified by established principles of states and of war, to spare the lives of brave men upon honorable terms. Should General Gates be inclined to treat upon those ideas, General Burgoyne would propose a cessation of arms during the time necessary to settle such preliminaries as he could abide by in any extremity. A convention was immediately opened, a discussion of some articles proposed by the American commander, which appeared to the British officers inadmissible, occasioned a delay of 2 or 3 days. These being accommodated, a treaty of surrender was signed the 17th of October, 1777. The substance of the treaty was that the troops under the command of General Burgoyne should march out of their camp with the honors of war and the artillery of the entrenchment to the verge of a certain river, where the arms and the artillery should be piled at the command of one of their own officers. That a free passage should be provided for the army to return to England, on condition that they should not serve again in America, during the present contest. That transport should enter the port of Boston for their reception whenever General Howe should think proper to request it, and that they should be quartered near Boston, that no delay might take place when an order for embarkation arrived, that the Canadians of every description should be permitted to return immediately, on the sole condition of their not again arming against the United States, that the army under General Burgoyne should march to the Massachusetts by the nearest route. They should be supplied with provisions, both on their route and in quarters, at the same rate of rations by order of General Gates as that of his own army, that the officers should wear their sidearms and be lodged according to their rank, nor at any time be prevented assembling their own troops, according to the usual military regulations, that passports should be granted to such officers as General Burgoyne should appoint, immediately to carry dispatches to Sir William Howe, to General Carleton, and to England by way of New York, and that General Gates should engage on the public faith, that none of the dispatches should be opened. After the second article, it was stipulated that if a cartel should take place, by which the army under General Burgoyne or any part of it might be exchanged, the second article should be void, as far as such exchange should be made. These and several other circumstances of less moment agreed to, the convention was signed with much solemnity. After the negotiation was finished and completed by the mutual signature of the officers, General Gates conducted not only as an officer of bravery, punctuality, and a nice sense of military honor, but with the fine feelings of humanity and the delicacy of the gentleman. He carried these ideas so far as to restrain the curiosity and pride of his own army, by keeping them within their lines while the British were piling their arms. He did not suffer a man among them to be a near witness to the humiliating sight of a haughty and once powerful foe, disarming and divesting themselves of the insignia of military distinction, and laying them at the feet of the conqueror. Thus, to the consternation of Britain, to the universal joy of America, and to the gratification of all capable of feeling that dignity of sentiment that leads the mind to rejoice in the prospect of liberty to their fellow men, was the northern expedition finished. A reverse of fortune was now beheld, that had not fallen under the calculation of either party. It is more easy to conjecture than agreeable to describe the chagrin of a proud, assuming foe, who had imperiously threatened to penetrate and lay waste cities and provinces, thus humbled by the arms of a people they had affected to hold in the utmost contempt, and their laurels thus faded beneath the sword of the victorious Americans. It was a tale without examples in British annals, that so many thousands of their best troops, in conjunction with a large body of German auxiliaries, commanded by generals and field officers of the first character, accompanied by many young gentlemen of noble family and military talents, should be thus reduced, mortified, and led captive through a long extent of country, where they had flattered themselves they should parade in triumph. Footnote: 5,752 men surrendered, exclusive of Canadians. 2,933 had been previously slain. End of footnote. They were obliged, before they reached their destined quarters, to traverse the pleasant grounds, pass through many flourishing towns and growing settlements, where they had expected to plant the standard of royalty, in all the cruel insolence of victory, to the utter extermination of every republican principle. The British army, with General Burgoyne at their head, was escorted from the plains of Saratoga to their quarters at Cambridge, about 300 miles, by 2 or 3 American field officers and a handful of soldiers as a guard. The march was solemn, sullen, and silent, but they were everywhere treated with such humanity and even delicacy that themselves acknowledged the civil deportment of the inhabitants of the country was without a parallel. They thought it remarkable that not an insult was offered, nor an opprobrious reflection cast, that could enhance the misery of the unfortunate or wound the feelings of degraded honor. Yet they were destined to a long captivity from various circumstances that arose relative to the punctual observance of some of the articles of the Treaty of Convention, which will be noticed in their place. End of Section 5. Section 6 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 11, Part 6. As soon as General Gates had finished the campaign of Saratoga, which terminated with so much eclat to himself, and so much glory to the arms of his country, he wrote a spirited letter to General Vaughan, who had been for some months ravaging, plundering, and burning with unparalleled barbarity the settlements on the North River. He informed him that, notwithstanding he had reduced the fine village of Kingston to ashes, and its inhabitants to ruin, that though he still continued to ravage and burn all before him, on both sides of the river, these instances of unexampled cruelty but established the glorious act of independence on the broad basis of the general resentments of the people. He added, "And is it thus, sir, your king's generals think to make converts to the royal cause? It is no less surprising than true. The measures they adopt to serve their master have the quite contrary effect. Abler generals and much more experienced officers than you can pretend to be are by the fortune of war now in my hands. This fortune may one day be yours, when it may not be in the power of anything human to save you from the just resentment of an injured people." Footnote: General Gates' letter published in the British Remembrancer. End of footnote. After this letter, General Gates stayed only to make the necessary arrangements and immediately moved on to the relief of the sufferers in that quarter. On the approach of the renowned conqueror of Bourgogne, the marauding parties under General Vaughan, Wallace, and Governor Tryon all retired to New York, there to give an account to administration of their barbarous exploits against the defenseless villages. General Clinton, with 3,000 troops, in conjunction with Commodore Hotham, had entered the Hudson at the beginning of October. At a great expense of men on both sides, they took possession of Stony Point, Verblanx, and the forts Montgomery and Clinton. The posts on the Hudson were defended by officers of dexterity and skill. Governor Clinton of New York, a gentleman distinguished for his patriotism, military talents, and unshaken firmness in the cause of his country, commanded the forts Clinton and Montgomery. General Putnam, an experienced and meritorious officer, was stationed lower down the river. But though the works were strong and defended with courage and ability by the American officers, they were overpowered by the number of the enemy and obliged to retreat with precipitation. After the storming of the forts Clinton and Montgomery, many of the soldiers and some officers were made prisoners. The retreat of those who escaped was effected with difficulty. Governor Clinton himself had time only to escape by crossing the river in a boat. The Count Grabowski, a Polish nobleman, a volunteer in the British Army, fell in the storm of the forts, as did Major Sill and several other officers of much military merit. General Clinton had laid waste the borders, dismantled the forts, burnt most of the houses, and spread terror and devastation on both sides of the Hudson. General Vaughan was left to finish the business. In one of his letters transmitted to England by Lord Viscount Howe, he boasts that he had not left one house in the flourishing and industrious town of Esopus, and offers no other reason for reducing it to ashes, but that the inhabitants had the temerity to fire from their houses on his advance, to rob them of liberty, property, and life. This is a mode of making war, that the politeness and civilization of modern Europe has generally agreed to criminate, though still practiced by many inhuman conquerors. But it was revived and adopted in the American system with all the ferocity that stimulated the ancient barbarians to sink in conflagration the Italian cities. These instances of severity were not singular. The same mad fury was exercised in almost every place where the strength and power of Britain obtained the advantage. This became the source of perpetual jealousies, and destroyed all confidence between Britons and Americans, even in the faith of treaties. Thus, some intimations from General Burgoyne while at Cambridge that the terms of convention were not fully complied with on the part of America, and some equivocal conduct with regard to the embarkation of the troops, raised a suspicion that the British officers intended to evade their engagement and transport the captured army to New York instead of conveying them directly to England as stipulated. This was grounded on a proposal that the convention troops should march to Newport and there embark. This occasioned a resolve of Congress that the troops should remain in their quarters at Cambridge until an explicit ratification of the Convention of Saratoga should be properly notified to Congress by the Court of Great Britain. This was heavily complained of by General Burgoyne and his officers, who said that this step was sinking the dignity and a breach of faith in that respected body. Political casuistry frequently palliates the deviations from rectitude in public bodies. Sound policy might justify the measure, but it is yet doubtful whether there was sufficient reason to believe that Burgoyne meant to break his engagements and throw his troops into New York, to be immediately again employed against the United States. New causes arose to enhance the difficulties of their exchange or their return to their native country. Thus this idle and dissipated army lay too long in the neighborhood of Boston for the advantage of either side. While their endurance, they disseminated their manners. They corrupted the students of Harvard College and the youth of the capital and its environs, who were allured to enter into their gambling parties and other scenes of licentiousness. They became acquainted with the designs, the resources, and the weaknesses of America, and there were many among them whose talents and capacity rendered them capable of making the most mischievous use of their knowledge. After long altercations between General Phillips and General Heath, who commanded in that quarter, relative to the disorders that took place among the soldiery of both parties, and mutual charges and breaches of the Articles of Convention, Congress directed that the British troops should march to Charlottesville in Virginia. They accordingly left Cambridge November the 10th, 1778. General Burgoyne had early requested leave to repair to England on parole, pleading the broken state of his health, the deranged situation of his private affairs, and the hazard of character, if not present to defend himself on the tidings of his defeat. He was permitted by Congress to depart, and arrived in England in May, 1778. But he met a very ungracious reception both from the people, the ministry, and his king. Notwithstanding his abilities to serve, and his fidelity to his master, he was refused an audience by Majesty, a court of inquiry or a court-martial, and for some time a hearing in the House of Commons. He had left England in the sanguine expectation of carrying conquest before him, wherever he appeared, of subduing the Americans and restoring tranquillity to the revolted colonies. He had returned on parole by the favor of that authority he had ever despised, and left his army in the hands of his enemies. The debates in Parliament on the occasion were warm and interesting. Some law officers of the Crown insisted that as a prisoner he was bound by his first engagements. They said to talk of a trial without the power to punish was a farce. It was urged that as a prisoner he was not capable of acting in his personal capacity, and that under his present obligations he was totally incapacitated for the exercise of any civil office, incompetent to any civil function, and incapable of bearing arms in his country. Footnote: Parliamentary debates. End of footnote. Thus was the haughty Burgoyne, affronted and mortified at the long and faithful services to his king and country. He was ordered immediately to repair to America as a prisoner, according to his engagements, but as the ill state of his health prevented his compliance, he was persecuted until he resigned all his employments under the crown. After some time had elapsed, General Burgoyne was permitted the opportunity of speaking for himself in the House of Commons, where he defended his own reputation and cause with ability and spirit. In the course of his argument, he cast many severe censures on the ministry, and did not scruple to pronounce them totally incapable of supporting the weight of public affairs in the present dangerous and critical emergency into which they had brought the nation. Nor was he without many powerful advocates, who both ridiculed and reprobated the severity with which he was treated. Strong intimations have been suggested, both within and without doors, that it might be thought expedient that the general should be sacrificed to save the reputation of the minister. Several expressions of his previous to his capture intimated his own apprehensions. In a letter to the Secretary of State he said, "My confidence is still placed in the justice of the king and his council to support the general they had thought proper to appoint to as arduous an undertaking and under as positive directions as a cabinet ever signed." In the same letter he gave his opinion of the number and discipline of the American troops and the many difficulties he had to encounter without the liberty of acting at discretion. General Burgoyne observed himself with regard to American bravery when speaking of the actions of the 19th of September. Few actions have been characterized by more obstinacy in attack or defense. The British bayonet was repeatedly tried ineffectually. 1,100 British soldiers, foiled in these trials, bore incessant fire from a succession of fresh troops in superior numbers for above 4 hours, and after a loss of above a third of their numbers, and in one of the regiments above 2/3, forced the enemy at last. Of a detachment of a captain and 48 artillerymen, the captain and 36 men were killed or wounded. These facts are marked by a concurrence of evidence that no man can dispute. The tribute of praise due to such troops will not be wanting in this generous nation, and it will certainly be accompanied with a just portion of shame to those who have dared to depreciate or fully valor so conspicuous, who have their ears open only to the prejudice of American cowardice, and having been always loud upon that courtly topic, stifle the glory of their countrymen to maintain a base consistency. He also adds with regard to the action of the 7th of October, if there can be any persons who, after considering the circumstances of this day, continue to doubt that the Americans possess the quality and faculty of fighting, call it by whatever name they please. They are of a prejudice that it would be very absurd longer to contend with. But no hazard or fatigue, bravery or misfortune, was thought a sufficient apology for the loss of his army. End of section 6. Section 7 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 11, Conclusion. The Northern Expedition had been a favorite object with the British administration. They were sanguine enough to suppose, and the nation was led to believe, that success in that quarter would reduce the turbulent spirits of Americans so low as to prevent further energy of opposition, and bring the whole country to a due sense of subordination and unconditional submission to the authority of Parliament. The low ebb of American affairs at the southward, previous to the success of General Gates, gave some reasonable grounds for such an expectation. It is not strange that a disappointment in this favorite object, which was calculated, if successful, to redound much to the glory of the British arms, should be equally mortifying to the pride of the ministry and the high-spirited people of England, or that it threw the Parliament and the nation into a ferment that did not easily subside. Many gentlemen of distinguished talents did honor to the feelings of the heart and the sagacity of the understanding, while it was a subject of parliamentary debate, by their humane, sensible, and judicious speeches, interspersed with pointed wit and brilliancy of sentiment. The conquest and capture of General Burgoyne and the British army under his command was undoubtedly the most fortunate circumstance of the United States that had yet taken place. It was the most capital and eventful military transaction from the commencement to the close of the American War. The termination of this expedition opened new views to the philosopher, the politician, and the hero, both at home and abroad. It disseminated a spirit and produced effects throughout America, which had been neither anticipated or calculated, until her sons paraded in the style of the conqueror before the humiliated hands of veteran British and German prisoners. So many thousands of brave men and distinguished officers, led captive through the wilderness, the plains, and the cities of the United States, was a spectacle never before beheld by the inhabitants, and the impression it made on their minds was in proportion to the novelty of the scene and the magnitude of its consequences. It was viewed as a prelude to events of the highest moment, both to the arms and to the future negotiations of the United States. British battalions were no longer deemed invulnerable, even by the most timid and uninformed sons of America. That formidable power which had spread dismay through the colonies, they now beheld as the object of curiosity, and her armies were viewed more in the light of compassion than of terror. Nor were the troops of the United States longer considered as a mere undisciplined rabble, either by the Parliament or the people of England. Their armies began to appear formidable, and conciliation was pressed from very respectable characters. From the moment of their recent victory, the United States were beheld in a still more honorable light by the other European powers. Most of them had yet stood undecided and wavering. None of them seemed determined on which side to declare, or whether to look coolly on as uninterested spectators, until Great Britain had sufficiently chastised her rebellious children. It is true some loans of money had been obtained from France previous to this period, and the sale of prizes had been permitted in the Gallic ports, but this appeared to be more in consequence of the benevolence and the enthusiasm of the people than the result of any governmental system to aid America effectually in her struggle for freedom and independence. The consequences of the brilliant success of General Gates, the influence of this event on the opinion of foreign nations, its operation on the councils of Britain, its effects on the policy of several European courts, and its important consequences throughout America, will be related concisely in the subsequent part of these annals. But it is proper, before we conclude the present chapter, to detail a few other circumstances relative to General Burgoyne. After some time had elapsed, and the agitation of party so far cooled as to permit him the public defense of his character, he gave an affecting epitome of his feelings, his difficulties and embarrassments in the northern expedition. He observed, "The remembrance of what I personally underwent cannot easily be suppressed, and I am sure I shall not outgo the indulgence of the candid if in delineating situations so affecting, I add feelings to justification. The defense of military conduct is an interesting point of professional honor, but to vindicate the heart is a duty to God and to society at large. Few conjunctures in the campaign I have been describing, few perhaps upon military record, can be found so distinguished by exigencies, or productive of such critical and anxious calls upon the public character and private affection as that which now took place. In the first place, the position of the army was untenable, and yet an immediate retreat was impossible, not only from the fatigue of the troops, but from the necessity of delivering fresh ammunition and provisions. The losses in the action were uncommonly severe. Sir Francis Clark, my aide-de-camp, had originally recommended himself to my attention by his talents and diligence. As service and intimacy opened his character more, he became endeared to me by every quality that could create esteem. I lost in him a useful assistant, an amiable companion, an attached friend. The state was deprived by his death of one of the fairest promises of an able general. The fate of Colonel Ackland, taken prisoner, and then supposed to be mortally wounded, was a second source of anxiety. General Fraser was expiring. In the course of the action, a shot had passed through my hat, and another had torn my waistcoat. I should be sorry to be thought at any time insensible to the protecting hand of Providence, but I have ever more particularly considered, and I hope not superstitiously, a soldier's hairbreadth escapes as incentives to duty, a marked renewal of the trust of being, for the due purposes of a public station, and under that reflection, to lose our fortitude by giving way to our affections, to be diverted by any possible self-emotion, from meeting a present exigency with our best faculties, were at once dishonor and impiety. Footnote: Burgoyne's Defense. End of footnote. Perhaps no general officer ever experienced a greater variety of untoward circumstances than General Burgoyne before the Convention and the surrender of his army to the victorious Americans. It requires a lively imagination to comprehend a full view of the difficulty of marching an army composed of heterogeneous materials, from Quebec to Saratoga, to traverse a forlorn wilderness, pathless thickets and swamps, extensive sheets of water, and navigable lakes defended by a resolute enemy, covered by strong works that cost the waste of many of his troops to overcome. It is true his German allies were brave, and the usual valor of British troops needs no encomium, but the Canadians and the Loyalists could not be depended upon, and the hordes of savages that joined his train were more the objects of terror than assistance, even to the masters unto whom they had enlisted. They pillaged, plundered, threatened, and occasionally murdered their friends, and when the cause grew desperate, retreated in tribes to take shelter in their distant forests. Of the Loyalists, General Burgoyne thus observes, many of them had taken refuge in Canada the preceding winter, and others had joined us as we advanced. The various interests which influenced their actions rendered all arrangement of them impracticable. One man's views went to the profit he was to enjoy when his course should be complete, another to the protection of the district in which he resided. A third was wholly intent upon revenge against his personal enemies, and all of them were repugnant even to an idea of subordination. Hence, the settlement who should act as a private man, and who as an officer, or in whose corps either should be, was seldom satisfactorily made among themselves, and as surely as it failed, succeeded a reference to the commander-in-chief, which could not be put by or delegated to another hand, without dissatisfaction, increase of confusion, and generally a loss of such services as they were really fit for, viz., searching for cattle, ascertaining the practicability of routes, clearing roads, and guiding detachments of columns upon the march. He further observed that the interests and the passions of the revolted Americans concenter in the cause of the Congress, and those of the Loyalists break and subdivide into various pursuits, with which the cause of the king has little or nothing to do. From these and other circumstances above detailed, even prejudice itself ought to allow a due share of praise to General Burgoyne for maintaining his resolution and perseverance so long, rather than to wound his character by censure, either as a soldier, a man of honor and humanity, or a faithful servant to his king. But talents, valor, or virtue are seldom a security against the vindictive spirit of party, or the resentment that results from the failure of favorite political projects. Thus, though the military abilities of General Burgoyne had been conspicuous, and his services acknowledged by his country, yet from the mortification of the monarch, the court, and the people of England, on the disgrace of their arms at Saratoga, he was not only suffered, but obliged to retire. Though the marked resentment of administration was long kept up against this unfortunate officer, he did not spend all the remainder of his days in private and literary pursuits. It is true, he never again acted in a military capacity, but time relieved the present oppression when he again took his seat in Parliament, and with manly eloquence not only defended the rights and liberties of his native isle against the arbitrary systems in vogue, but asserted the justice and propriety of American opposition. This he did with becoming dignity, and an impartiality which he never might have felt but from the failure of his northern expedition. The reputation the American arms acquired by this defeat not only humbled the proud tone of many British officers, besides General Burgoyne, but did much to hasten the alliance with France, and brought forward events that accelerated the independence of America. End of section 7. Section 8 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 12, Part 1. Observations on the conduct of the British Parliament previous to the capture of Burgoyne. The ineffectual efforts of the commissioners sent to America in consequence of Lord North's conciliatory bill. Their attempts to corrupt individuals and public bodies. Negotiation broken off. Manifesto published by the commissioners. Counter-declaration by Congress. Sir William Howe repairs to England. While America gloried in her recent successes against the Northern Army, and was making all possible preparations for vigorous action at the southward, the coercive system in Britain was so far from being relaxed that the most severe measures were urged with bitterness and acrimony. The speeches of the king were in the same tone of despotism as formerly. The addresses of Parliament were in the usual style of compliment and applause, as if they had little else to do but to keep each other in good humor until alienation was complete, and the colony so far connected with other powers that there could be no hope of reconciliation. But though a union of sentiment and a perfect conformity to the royal will, previous to the news of Burgoyne's defeat, appeared in the majority of both houses of Parliament, yet the measures of the ministry were, as usual, warmly opposed by some gentlemen of the first abilities in the nation. Several of the principal nobility were in the minority, and urged an accommodation before America should be irretrievably lost. It was recommended to the minister rather to forge bands of amity for the minds than chains for the bodies of Americans. The present moment of uncertainty with regard to success was urged as the proper season for giving the most unequivocal proofs of cordiality, by requesting His Majesty to order a cessation of hostilities and the immediate adoption of measures for accommodation. Footnote: Debates in Parliament before the news of termination of the Northern Campaign reached England. End of footnote. Mr. Fox, whose powers of oratory were the admiration of the world, not only reasoned against their measures, but ridiculed the ministry in the most pointed manner for their ignorance of America. From the outset of the controversy, he alleged that they had mistaken the extent of the 13 colonies, and considered the Massachusetts as including the whole, nor were they less mistaken in the weight of opposition they had to encounter. He observed they had ever been blind to the consequences of their own measures, or they never would have rejected the most dutiful and loyal petitions, more especially that presented by Mr. Penn, late governor of Pennsylvania, even after the battles of Lexington and Bunker Hill. Footnote: Governor Penn was the last proprietary governor of the state of Pennsylvania. After the Revolution, different modes were adopted. The patent granted by the Crown to the celebrated Penn, the founder of that colony, included a vast territory, but the enormous claims of the family were extinguished by an act of the legislature of Pennsylvania. This was not in consequence of any political delinquency of the late governor, who had acquitted himself with ability and address, and retained his patriotism and attention to the interests of his country to the end of the contest. The heirs of the family voluntarily relinquished their extensive claims in consideration of a very handsome sum of money paid to the claimants by the legislature in lieu of all quit rents that might hereafter be demanded. End of footnote. He expatiated on the absurdity and injustice of the bill for transporting Americans to England for trial, the Quebec Act, the Restraining Bill, the Declaratory Act, and the Boston Port Bill. All papers relative to America for 3 years past were ordered to be laid before the House, and the state of the Army and the expenditures in the course of the war loudly called for. But amidst the severe scrutiny of the House, the anxiety of the nation, the perseverance of the King, and the perplexity of the minister, all parties were thunderstruck by the arrival of the intelligence of Burgoyne's defeat and the capture of the army at Saratoga. A general gloom overspread every countenance. The severest censures were cast on the late measures of administration. Indignation burnt in the bosoms of those who opposed them. Clamor raged without doors. Asperity, sarcasm, and reproach from the lip of truth within. And notwithstanding his abilities and his firmness, the minister was distressed. The minority increased and opposition was strengthened. Lord Chatham rose with his usual energy, eloquence, and commanding spirit, and reprobated both the war and the mode of prosecuting it, and with vehemence and acrimony asserted that a court system of wickedness had been adopted for the last 15 years, subversive of all faith and confidence, tending to extinguish all principle in the different orders of the community, and that an ascendancy had been obtained by worthless men, the dregs of party, where no influence ought to exist, that a spirit of delusion had gone forth, the people had been deceived by ministers, and Parliament had sanctioned the deception. False lights had been held out to the country gentlemen, imposed on by the ideal project of an American revenue, but that the visionary phantom, conjured up for the basest purposes of deception, was about to vanish. The minister, footnote Lord North, end of footnote, though attacked, mortified, and embarrassed, retreated with ability and address from ground to ground, through the debates and endeavored to shift the blame from himself, and cast the failure of the system and the odium of disappointment on the want of capacity in the officers employed. He manifested his regret for the unhappy differences between the two countries in passionate expressions, and urged that the conciliatory plan he had proposed some time before might be immediately adopted, and that commissioners should be sent to America with powers to restore tranquility, without further delay. He acknowledged that he began to despair of reducing the colonies by arms, unless a disunion could be effected, and the intervention of foreign powers in their behalf decidedly prevented. But the people in several counties were so infatuated by the popular theme of an American revenue that subscriptions were opened in London, Bristol, and other places for raising and supporting a body of troops at private expense to supply the deficiency in the army by the Convention of Saratoga. The legality of this measure was contested in both Houses of Parliament, and a resolve was proposed by the Earl of Abingdon that granting monies for private uses, and without the sanction of Parliament, was against both the letter and the spirit of the Constitution, that obtaining money by subscription and applying it to His Majesty's use, in such manner as he should think fit, was unconstitutional, and a direct infringement of the principles of the British Constitution. But the measure was not discountenanced by authority, and the subscriptions went on. If not first suggested by them, these subscriptions were encouraged by some of the most affluent of the American refugees, who had repaired to England on the retreat of General Howe from Boston. This appearance of settled rancor against their native country increased the resentment of their countrymen, and in consequence thereof, some of their estates, which had been only sequestered, were confiscated and sold, and the monies arising therefrom deposited in the public treasury. But many of this class of people, who laid their real or pretended sufferings before administration, were afterwards amply provided for by the liberality of the British government, though not adequate to their own expectations. All Europe had beheld with astonishment and applause the exertions and struggles of the American colonies against the opulence, the arms, and the intrigues of Britain. It was now 3 years that they had, with uncommon resolution and systematical decision, supported their armaments by sea and land, without a single ally. The American Congress had indeed, as early as the beginning of the autumn 1776, appointed commercial agents to several European courts, empowering them to procure arms, ammunition, and clothing, on the credit of the United States. They were received politely by the nation, though not publicly countenanced by the court of France, on their first arrival. Yet their negotiations had been favorable to trade, and to the condemnation of a vast number of prizes that had been taken by the Americans and sent into the several ports of France. Dr. Franklin was soon after empowered to act as an American plenipotentiary there, and arrived in France December 1776. The celebrity of his character and the popularity of his mission ensured him the warmest reception from all ranks, and the minister gave him private encouragement to hope for all necessary aid and a full completion of the wishes of his constituents. Footnote: the Count de Virginieres. End of footnote. The Spanish ambassador likewise at this time requested copies of his instructions and a sketch of the state of America, which he forwarded to His Catholic Majesty, as the two courts were determined to act in perfect unison, although no national compact was completed between France and America until early in the year 1778. Footnote: see Dr. Franklin's letter to Congress, March 1778. End of footnote. It required time to ripen a measure in a despotic court to support a struggle like the present, a struggle unparalleled in modern nations, an effort for the liberties of mankind by colonial opposition to the parent state. The proud and potent sovereignty of Britain might rationally be expected to have an influence on the political systems of the greatest part of Europe. Besides, the intrigues of the British cabinet and the policy of France might cooperate to postpone the event of any foreign alliance with the colonies until American firmness had been tried in the ordeal of affliction, and her constancy and success had rendered her more respectable in the eyes of older nations and long-practiced statesmen. But the conquest and capture of a British army, commanded by officers of distinguished name and abilities, was considered as a decided proof of the importance of the connection, and hastened the determination of France to conclude a treaty that might cut off all hope of reconciliation between the colonies and the mother country. Thus, on the 6th of February, 1778, a treaty of alliance, amity, and commerce was signed by the minister on the part of France and by Benjamin Franklin, Arthur Lee, and Silas Deane, Esquires, on the part of the United States of America. Dr. Franklin was immediately introduced to His Most Christian Majesty as the Minister Plenipotentiary for the American States, and on the May following, the Sieur Girard arrived on the continent in quality of ambassador and was introduced in form to the American Congress. End of Section 8. Section 9 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 12, Part 2. This mortifying event had for some time been predicted by the minority in the British Parliament, yet the minister affected to disbelieve even the probability of its taking place, and as late as March the 11th, 1778, desired that it might be remembered he declared in his place that he knew of no such treaty, either in existence or contemplation. Only 8 days after this, the Duc de Noailles, in the name of his sovereign, announced the treaty in form, and a rescript thereof was delivered to the King of Great Britain. The ignorance or incapacity of the minister in not obtaining more early intelligence of the conduct of the House of Bourbon, or his wickedness in concealing the information if he had received it, was echoed from the House to the city, and from the city through the nation. But there was little reason to doubt, notwithstanding the solemn declaration of the minister, that he had obtained more authentic documents than he was willing to acknowledge of the transactions of the French cabinet. This was undoubtedly the reason why the conciliatory bills were hurried through both houses and sent over to Lord and General Howe before the act was completed or commissioners named for the purpose. Many distinguished members in both houses of Parliament insisted that an immediate suspension of hostilities and a direct acknowledgment of the independence of America was the only medium of safety. They justly observed that the burning some of their fairest towns, desolating their lands, plundering their houses, and abusing their wives and daughters, had left such an acrimonious stamp on the minds of Americans as destroyed all faith and confidence in the appearances of accommodation or advances towards reconciliation. Others, still sanguine in prosecution of measures less derogatory to the pride of Britain, urged a change of ministry and a new arrangement of officers in both the civil and military departments. At the same time, they urged that commissioners should be appointed to repair to America, to confer with Congress as a legal body, or with the state legislatures in their present form, and that they should be authorized to offer a cessation of hostilities, a repeal of all obnoxious bills, a free trade, a representation in Parliament, and, in short, almost everything they could wish, except an explicit acknowledgment of independence. This mode was adopted, and commissioners appointed to make overtures from the parent state that would once have been received with the highest tokens of gratitude, but that period was irretrievably past. Probably had administration taken a cool retrospect to the natural operations of the human mind, and reflected on the insult and mortification of the repeated rejection of sincere and ardent petitions, of the commencement of hostilities by staining the sword with the blood of innocents, of the miseries that awaited the unhappy victims, which the uncertain chances of war had thrown into their hands, and the numberless instances of deception that have been practiced on the less experienced politicians of America. They must themselves have been sensible that all ideas of peace on any conditions, but the most decided acknowledgment of the independence of the United States, were precluded. But men impelled by a partiality for systems of their own fabricating, whether they originated in passion, plausibility, or interest, can seldom bend their pride to a generous dereliction of their favorite object, though reason or time might have brought to their view a full conviction of its absurdity or impracticability. Great Britain was at this time herself without allies, nor had she any reason to expect the assistance of foreigners to facilitate the subjugation of America, except the auxiliaries she had obtained at an immense expense from some of the petty princes of Germany. They had some time before applied to the States of Holland to send forward a Scotch brigade in their service, in aid of their hostile operations against the colonies, but by the single voice of one of their honest Republicans, it was prevented, and the proposal rejected in a style characteristic of his nation. He observed that it was more proper for Britain to hire Janissaries for their purpose than to apply to the Batavians, who had so dearly purchased their own liberties. Footnote: Speech of Van der Kempelen in the Assembly of Overfell. End of footnote. Thus, while a war with France was apprehended to be the immediate and inevitable consequence of the weak, pernicious, and perverse counsels of the British cabinet, the opposition declared the nation had everything to fear from the House of Bourbon, and nothing to hope from the assistance of other European powers. These circumstances, generally known, occasioned the most painful feelings to those who were actuated by the principles of justice or humanity, nor were the minds of such as were influenced only by the rancor of party much more tranquil. But the loss of the colonies, the independence of America, her connection with France, their hereditary foe, could not yet be digested by the king, the ministry, or the nation, and the conciliatory proposals were voted to be carried forward on other principles than those of humanity or equity. The army and navy establishments were augmented, and the proud display of war, power, and conquest was again to accompany the soft voice of peace and reunion. The gentlemen appointed to undertake the arduous work of conciliation with the American states, after the inhumanity and irritation of a 3 years' war, were the Earl of Carlisle, Sir William Eden, Governor Johnstone, and Sir Henry Clinton. Qualified for negotiation, and determined if possible to reunite the revolted colonies with Great Britain, they left England with these flattering expectations, and arrived in the Delaware the latter part of May, amidst every preparation on both sides for opening a vigorous campaign. During their residence in America, they faithfully executed their trust, and by every exertion, both in their joint and separate capacity, they endeavored to fulfill the expectation of their sovereign. Yet from the reception which Congress had recently given to a previous intimation of their designs, the commissioners could have no very sanguine hopes of success. General Howe had, as early as April the 21st, sent a flag to General Washington, informing him of his own expectations. At the same time, he transmitted him a copy of the conciliatory bill. These the general immediately forwarded to Congress, who appointed a committee to consider the proposition. It did not take much time to deliberate before the committee reported a number of reasons why the proposals of the British court appeared to them fallacious, and that it was their opinion that the United States could, with no propriety, hold any conference or treaty with commissioners on the part of Britain, unless, as a preliminary, they withdrew their fleets and armies, and in positive and express terms acknowledged the independence of the United States. This spirited language, before any account of the completion of any treaty with France had arrived in America, discovered a due dependence on their own magnanimity and firmness, and by the dignity of their resolutions, Congress manifested a consciousness of the justice of their cause and a reliance on that providential support they had hitherto remarkably experienced. Perhaps at no time since hostilities had commenced between Great Britain and the colonies could the United States have been found less disposed to negotiate on the terms now offered by the British government than at the present. When the commissioners arrived, they found the news of an alliance with France and a treaty of amity and commerce with that nation had reached Yorktown, where Congress was sitting, the 2nd day of May, a very short time after they had rejected the proposals sent on by Lord Howe. Footnote: these overtures were rejected on the 28th of April, 1778. See Journals of Congress. End of footnote. All America was apprised of the divisions in the British Parliament and happy in their own unanimity. An ambassador had been appointed to repair to America, and her independence was acknowledged by one of the first courts in Europe. The brilliant successes of the last year and the promising appearances on the opening the campaign of the present all cooperated to lead the Congress and the state legislatures to continue the high tone of sensibility and dignity, becoming a free and independent people, just emancipated from foreign domination. The commander-in-chief, the officers of the army, the soldiers in the field, and indeed every description of people, felt a new degree of enthusiasm and kindled from the sanguine expectation of all necessary aid, in consequence of an alliance with France, which was now completed to their wishes. The commissioners on their arrival lost no time. They immediately opened their correspondences, both public and private. The secretary to this commission was the celebrated Dr. Ferguson, a gentleman well known in the literary world by his eloquent historical and philosophical writings. Yet the respect for his character and abilities, which would have ensured his welcome on any occasion unconnected with political considerations, could not influence Congress to grant him passports, as requested by the commissioners, only to deliver in person the credentials for opening a treaty. In consequence of this refusal, the King's Commission and a letter from the commissioners were both sent on by the usual military posts. The letter contained some flattering advances toward America and many complimentary expressions to individuals, but it was without the smallest appearance of any recognition of the independence of the United States. Many reproachful strictures on the insidious policy of France were interwoven in the letter. This rendered their address still more exceptional in the eyes of Congress, and their overtures were generally disgusting to the people at large. End of section 9. Section 10 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 12, Part 3. In the present crisis, it was not thought either polite or politic by anyone to interlard the proposals for an accommodation with America with indelicate reflections on the new allies of the United States, almost at the moment when Congress had received the most indubitable proofs of the friendship of the House of Bourbon, and when every bosom glowed with hope and expectation of the highest advantages from an alliance just sealed by each party and ratified by Congress to the mutual satisfaction of both nations. Yet allowances ought ever to be made for hereditary and national prejudices, as well as for private disgusts. In both cases, the soreness of the human mind feels the keenest sensibility, when all wounds are probed by a hand prepared to strike a mortal blow, the first favorable opportunity. Thus the commissioners and the British nation beheld with indignation and bitterness the arm of France, their hated rival, stretch out to rescue their colonies, now the United States, from the despotic views of the King and Parliament of England. When Congress had given the proposals for peace, offered under the sanction of royal authority, a fair and candid discussion, a reply was concisely drawn up and signed by the Honorable Henry Lawrence, President of the Continental Congress. It was observed in this answer to the proposals that both the late Acts of Parliament and a commission empowering a number of gentlemen to negotiate, and the letter received by Congress from those gentlemen, all went upon the same mistaken ground, on the supposition that the people of America were the subjects of the Crown of Britain. That such ideas were by no means admissible. Yet notwithstanding the injustice of the claim on which the war originated, and the savage manner of conducting it, Congress was inclined to peace, whenever the King of England should manifest a sincere disposition therefor, by an explicit acknowledgment of the independence of America, and by withdrawing his fleets and armies, that they will then enter into a treaty of commerce, not inconsistent with treaties already existing. They also referred the commissioners to their resolves and determinations of the 23rd of April, a short time before the arrival of the Treaty of Alliance with France. This drew out a second letter from the commissioners, drafted with much art, ability, and address. In this they observed that they were not disposed to dispute about words, that a degree of independence was admitted in their letter of the 10th of June, that the people of America had the privilege of disposing of their own property, and to govern themselves without any reference to Britain, beyond what is necessary to preserve a union of force, in which mutual safety consists. They added that danger from their hereditary enemy and gratitude to those who had hazarded much for their affection to Britain must for a time prevent His Majesty from withdrawing his fleets and armies, but that they were willing to enter on a discussion of circumstances that might be necessary to secure and enlarge their independence, and that they wished for full communication of the powers by which Congress was authorized to treat with foreign nations. They intimated that there had been no resolutions of the particular assemblies conferring this power. Thus an effort was made in the beginning of negotiation to diffuse jealousies and divide the people. In short, the sophistry that marked their public declarations and the insidious proposals made to corrupt private persons were very unbecoming to negotiators for peace, and inconsistent both with the probity of individual character and the dignity of their master. It does not appear that the conduct of any of these gentlemen singly was equally reprehensible with that of Governor Johnstone. By private letters to some of the members of Congress, he endeavored to warp their integrity with the flattering promises of distinguished offices and emoluments, in proportion to their risk in promoting the present views of administration. Footnote: the principal of these were Joseph Reed and Robert Morris, Esquire, of Pennsylvania, and Francis Dana of Massachusetts. End of footnote. He was bold enough to say, Washington and the President would have a right to everything a grateful nation could bestow, if they would be instrumental once more in uniting the interests of Great Britain and America. Footnote: see Governor Johnstone's letter to Robert Morris, Esquire, laid before Congress, June 1778. End of footnote. His advances to Mr. Reed, an influential member of Congress, was still more openly affronted by offering him a direct bribe and naming the conditions for the sale of his honor. Governor Johnstone doubtless thought he knew his men when he selected Mr. Reed, Robert Morris, Esquire, and Mr. Francis Dana to open his correspondence with and try the golden effects of secret influence that had been so often successful in his native land. He might perhaps think it some extenuation of the affront offered to Mr. Reed that he had formerly fallen under some suspicions from his countrymen. He had been early and zealous in opposition to Britain, had repaired to Cambridge as aide-de-camp to General Washington, was afterwards appointed adjutant general, and continued in habits of intimacy and confidence with the commander-in-chief until the retreat through the Jerseys and the gloomy and desperate situation of American affairs towards the close of the winter of 1776. His fortitude then forsook him, and despairing of brighter prospect to this country, more from timidity than disaffection, he was on the point of relinquishing the public cause. Footnote: see Cadwallader's letter to and of Mr. Reed. They exhibit strong suspicions that, agitated by fear in the most gloomy period of American affairs, he really contemplated security for himself and friends under the protection of the British standard. This appeared at the time to be the apprehension of many of his connections. However, if he was really as culpable as represented by some of those letters, he soon recovered his firmness, his character, and the confidence of his country, and the commander-in-chief. End of footnote. It was asserted he absolutely applied to Count Donop at Burlington for a protection for himself and family, on condition of his forsaking his country in the lowest stage of her distress, and his general and friend at a period when he most needed his assistance. But the brilliant action at Trenton and the subsequent successes at Princeton and other places in the beginning of the year 1777 restored the tone of his nerves so far as to enable him to act with distinguished firmness, fidelity, and bravery on many trying occasions, and disposed almost everyone to throw a veil over the momentary weakness of a mind generally well disposed to his country. Footnote: Mr. Reed had publicly announced his regret that a letter written by him to General Lee in the year 1776 had been published to the world. He observed that that letter was written in haste, and written in a moment of great anxiety, not from any diminution of affection for General Washington, whom he justly styles a great and good man. This letter was undoubtedly the result of Mr. Reed's apprehensions, at a period when there was utmost danger that all would be lost to America, from various causes that prevented more vigorous operations. But he ever after expressed the highest respect for the character of the commander-in-chief, and observed that his countrymen might rest in full confidence in the judgment, abilities, and discretion of General Washington. End of footnote. These circumstances were known in the British Army, and probably induced Governor Johnstone to think Mr. Reed a proper subject for his designs. He proposed as an adequate reward for his treachery, if Mr. Reed would engage his interest to promote the object of their commission, that he should have any office in the colonies, in the gift of his Britannic Majesty, and the sum of 10,000 pounds sterling in hand. This extraordinary proposal was made through a lady who had some connections in the British Army. Finding she expected an explicit reply, and being a lady of so much respectability as to demand it, Mr. Reed answered that he was not worth the purchasing, but such as he was, the King of Great Britain was not rich enough to do it. Mr. Johnstone knew Mr. Morris to be a commercial character, a speculating genius, a calculator of finances, and a confidential friend of General Washington. He might probably think that if the commander-in-chief of the American army could once be brought to listen to proposals, or to barter his fidelity, no one could make a better bargain for Britain than Mr. Morris, who had so much the ear and confidence of General Washington. From some circumstances in Mr. Dana's former conduct, Mr. Johnstone might think himself sure of his influence without bidding very high, and though liberal of his master's gold, it does not appear that he offered him a direct bribe. Mr. Johnstone's confidence in the success of his attempt on the fidelity of this gentleman was probably grounded on a circumstance generally known. Mr. Dana had formerly fallen under the suspicions of many of his countrymen that he was not friendly to the opposition of British measures. This suspicion arose from his having repaired to England a short time before the commencement of the war, but within a year after the Battle of Lexington, he had eradicated those prejudices by returning to his native country, entrusted with some secret communications from the Friends of America, then in England. This recommended him to favor and reconciliation with his countrymen. They laid aside their suspicions, and some characters of known integrity brought him forward, and soon after he was chosen a member of the General Congress. The above traits of character might be thought proper materials for a British commissioner to operate upon, but Governor Johnstone was mistaken in the character of Americans, for, notwithstanding their passions, their foibles, or their weaknesses, there were few at that time who would not have spurned at the idea of being purchased. They highly resented the effort to tamper with their integrity at any price, when the liberty of America was the stake. End of section 10. Section 11 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 12, Conclusion. These letters and transactions were immediately laid before Congress by the several gentlemen, who thought themselves particularly insulted by such unequivocal attempts on their honor and fidelity. This demeanor of one of the commissioners was resented in a manner that might be expected from the respectable body. The American Congress at this period was, with few exceptions, composed of men jealous of their rights, proud of their patriotism and independence, and tenacious of their honor and probity. They resolved that as they felt, so they ought to demonstrate the most pointed indignation against such daring attempts to corrupt their integrity. They added that it was incompatible with their honor to hold any further intercourse with George Johnstone, Esquire, more especially to negotiate with him on affairs in which the cause of liberty was interested. Footnote. Mr. Johnstone's private letter to the President of Congress and Mr. Lawrence's reply, which was equally honorable to himself and to his country, and which breathed the spirit of dignity, independence, and virtue, which uniformly marked the character of this gentleman. The reader is referred to the Journals of Congress. End of footnote. This resolve, announced in all the public papers, drew out a very angry declaration from Mr. Johnstone. He intimated that he should decline acting in future as a commissioner, or in any other way negotiating with Congress. He observed that the business would be left in abler hands, and that he should be happy to find no other impediment in the way of accommodation after he was removed, but that he was inclined to believe the resolutions of Congress were dictated on similar motives to the Convention of Saratoga. Mr. Johnstone alluded to a resolve of Congress in reply to the offer of the commissioners to ratify the Convention of Saratoga. To this offer they had replied that no ratification that may be tendered in consequence of powers that only reach the case by construction, or which may subject all transactions relative thereto, either to the future approbation or disapprobation of Parliament, can be accepted by Congress. To the resentful language of Governor Johnstone he added that Congress acted a desultory part, contrary to the wishes of their constituents, and after many very severe reflections on the connection with France, he avowed a total disregard either of the good or ill opinion of such a body, but acknowledged that making a just allowance for men acting under the heats of civil convulsions, he had a regard for some individuals that composed it. Doubtless, at the moment of this passionate declaration, Mr. Johnstone had forgotten the flattering epithets, even to adulation, that he had recently bestowed on the same body he now affected to hold in sovereign contempt. But Congress persevered in their usual steady line of conduct and took no further notice of the letters, declarations, or addresses of the commissioners. Thus closed their public negotiations, if they did not despair of dividing the colonies. Letters and addresses were still circulated to the governors of particular states and to private gentlemen, and inflammatory declarations were spread throughout America. The poison of these new modes of overture for peace between contending nations was effectually antidoted by the spirited publications of several gentlemen of ability in their private capacity. Footnote: W.H. Drayton and others. End of footnote. The last effort made by these disappointed negotiators before they left America was the publication of a manifesto signed by 3 of them and dispersed throughout the continent. This address appeared to be dictated more by resentment and despair than expectation or hope. It contained an endeavor to foment jealousies between the several states and insinuated that Congress were not authorized by the constituents to reject the offers of Britain or to enter into alliances with foreign nations. Proposals were made for separate treaties, either with the governors, the legislative bodies, or individual gentlemen, and offers of pardon were held out to any in civil or military departments, and to all descriptions of men who should, within 40 days, desert the service of their country and enlist under the standard of Britain. This was not the most offensive part of this extraordinary manifesto. Vindictive threatenings were denounced against all who should continue deaf to these gracious and generous calls of their sovereign. It finished by declaring that if America still preferred her connection with the insidious and hereditary enemy of Britain, she must expect the operations of war would be continued in such modes as tended most to distress, depopulate, and ruin. Footnote: see the manifesto at large in the British Remembrancer and in the Annual Register, as well as in the Journals of Congress. End of footnote. Mankind is seldom driven into compliance by the haughty threats of powerful adversaries, unless they feel their own weakness to such a degree as to render them abject. But America, conscious of her own internal strength and sure of the assistance of foreign allies, rather spurned at the virulent spirit of this declaration. It did not increase their respect towards the negotiators for peace, nor were the Americans alone offended at the style and manner of this address. It was considered as deficient both in policy and humanity, even by some officers in the British Army. One of them, of high rank, immediately repaired to England and declared with honest indignation in the House of Commons, of which he was a member, that he could not bear the attempt to convert soldiers into butchers, assassins, and incendiaries, or the abominable idea of sheathing his sword in the bowels of age and innocence, nor would he be instrumental in tarnishing the luster of the British name by acts of barbarity in obedience to the mandates of the most infamous administration that ever disgraced a free country. Footnote: see debates in Parliament. End of footnote. But by the activity of officers of less delicacy and tenderness, the theory of cruelty held out by the commissioners was soon realized by the perpetration of every crime, and the extreme rigor of war, which in modern times has been ameliorated by the general consent of civilized nations, was renewed in America in all the barbarous shapes that the ingenuity or the wickedness of man could invent. Soon after the manifesto of the commissioners was published, a declaration was issued by Congress, though not in terms equally cruel and threatening. They, however, discovered their resentment by the severity of their language, and a sort of license was encouraged for retaliation on individuals. If the British proceeded to murder the inhabitants and burn the houses of private persons, they thought themselves justifiable in this from past sufferings and the present threatenings of officers commissioned to reconcile instead of further irritating the injured Americans. Congress reproached them with meanness in attempting to carry their point by bribery, corruption, and deceit, and charged their nation with making a mock at humanity by the wanton destruction of men, a mock at religion by impious appeals to God, whilst in the violation of his sacred commands, and a mockery of reason itself by supposing that the liberty and happiness of America could safely be entrusted to those who had sold their own, unawed by a sense of virtue or shame. They appealed to the searcher of hearts for the rectitude of their intentions, and observed that not instigated by anger or revenge, they should, through every possible change of fortune, adhere to their determinations. In this state and temper of the Congress, the people, and the commissioners, Sir Henry Clinton took the command of all the royal troops in America. Previous to the openings of the summer campaign, Sir William Howe had obtained leave to repair to England. His intended absence was much regretted by the British Army, and as a man of pleasure and address, by the gay part of the city of Philadelphia. Every manifestation of respect was expressed on the occasion, and the most superb display of modern luxury exhibited in an elegant entertainment, which drew attention from the novelty of the style. The mischianza was considered a new species of pleasure, but the appellation was only an additional decoration to an effort designed to pay the highest compliment and respect, both to the military and the private character of General Howe. Notwithstanding this and other testimonials of the affection of his officers and his army, he was censured by the ministry on his arrival in England, and a public clamor prevailed against his general conduct during his command in America. In consequence of the ill temper excited against him, he published a long narrative in his own defense, and urged a free examination of his conduct in the House of Commons. But the minister appeared averse to strictures that might lay open too many of the secrets of the cabinet. However, several distinguished gentlemen of the army were at last called to examination, and on the whole gave a favorable testimony to the military character and operations of General Howe, and extenuated the failure of particular maneuvers by the difficulty and embarrassment of his situation in a country where it was impossible for him to know whether he was surrounded by friends or foes, and where he often found himself deceived by the misrepresentations of the loyalists. In order to invalidate the evidence of Lord Cornwallis and other respectable characters, the party against Sir William Howe procured the examination evidence of Joseph Galloway and some others of the most inveterate refugees who had fled from America, and were disappointed that the subjugation of their country was thus long delayed. Much censure fell on the ministry for their resorting to the testimony of American refugees, pensioners, and custom-house officers, whose places, pensions, and existence depended on their adherence to ministerial measures, to invalidate the evidence of military men of high rank and great professional knowledge. Sir William Howe was not again vested with command during the American War. Some other officers, either disgusted or discouraged, returned to England after the summer campaign. Several of them were advanced and sent out again in the succeeding spring to pursue the work of slaughter, or to humble the haughty spirit of Americans at the feet of monarchy. A number of these ill-fated officers, whose merits were conspicuous in their line, did not again return to the bosom of their native country, the beloved island of Britain, where their surviving friends were left to weep at the recollection of the ashes of the brave, scattered over the heights and plains of the American world. End of section 11. Section 12 of History, the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 13, Part 1. Evacuation of Philadelphia. Battle of Monmouth. General Lee censured. General Clinton reaches New York. The Count d'Estaing arrives there. Repairs to Rhode Island. Expedition unsuccessful. French fleet rendezvous at Boston to refit after the damages sustained by a storm. Lord Howe leaves the American seas. Marauding exploits of General Gray. Destruction of Wyoming. Expedition into the Indian Territories. The new commission with which Sir Henry Clinton was now vested was prompt, arduous, and replete with consequences of the highest magnitude to his country and to his own reputation. The Trident man of war had arrived in the Delaware early in the month of June, 1778. In this ship came the British Commissioners for Conciliation, and through the hand of Sir William Eden, General Clinton received peremptory orders to evacuate the city of Philadelphia within 6 days after their reception. Accordingly, the whole British army decamped and began their march toward New York on the 18th of June. The sudden desertion of a city that had been so much the object of their warmest wishes tended at once to dishearten the adherents to the royal cause and to invigorate the operations of their antagonists. It could not be expected that General Washington would remain a quiet spectator of this movement of the British troops. He immediately dispatched a reconnoitering party under General Maxwell to harass their march. Footnote: before General Washington moved, he called a council of officers to consult on the expediency of attacking the British on their march. They were almost unanimously opposed to the measure, as the failure of success would be ruin to the American army. But the American commander, with 2 or 3 of his best officers, had no reluctance at hazarding the consequences of a general action. End of footnote. The Marquis de Lafayette also marched at the head of a detachment to meet them and impede their progress, and General Lee, with 2 brigades, was ordered to follow and support him. The British commander, prepared for this interruption, suddenly attacked and routed the cavalry under the Marquis. By this the infantry were deranged, and General Washington, finding an action of moment was likely to ensue, posted himself, after several military movements, as advantageously as possible, near the heights of Monmouth. The Americans spirited and courageous, the British resolute, brave, and desperate. A sharp conflict succeeded. The military game of death and retreat, of recovery and slaughter, was kept up for several hours without decision. But a misunderstanding on the disobedience of orders by General Lee occasioned such a derangement on the American side as gave the opportunity for a safe retreat to the Royal Army, in spite of the valor and intrepidity of their opponents. Many on both sides fell by the intense heat of the weather. It was one of those days not unusual in the southern clime, when the stroke of the sun is instantaneously fatal to human life, without the agitation and fatigue inseparable from the hour of battle. Some warm expressions in the heat of engagement from General Washington drew several letters from Lee that could not be passed over in silence. For these, and for his deportment through the events of the day of action, he was suspended from his command, and afterwards tried by a court-martial. The exigencies of affairs, as well as his misconduct, made it necessary that he should lie under censure for disobedience and disrespect to the commander-in-chief. Yet many of his brother officers advocated, or at least extenuated his conduct. Footnote: the court-martial adjudged that he should retire from the army and lie under suspension for 1 year. End of footnote. Perhaps it might not have been either treachery, cowardice, envy, or any other unworthy motive that influenced the conduct of General Lee. He had but recently recovered his liberty after he was captured at Hackensack. Previous to that time, the American army was too justly considered by him an undisciplined rabble. They had indeed, in his absence, made great improvements in the art of war and the necessary arrangements of military discipline. However, he had not yet a proper confidence in the infant troops he commanded, when opposed to the superiority of British battalions, actuated by necessity in addition to constitutional bravery. He might retreat more from the cautious prudence of an experienced officer than from any design to betray or disobey the orders of the commander-in-chief. But it is certain he did not on all occasions discover a due respect either for the character or talents of General Washington. General Lee was never again employed in American service, and undoubtedly died a martyr to chagrin, disappointment, and personal abuse, in consequence of the ingratitude of some of his former friends, arising from the popularity of a more favored, fortunate, and meritorious officer. After his trial and suspension, General Lee retired to a little farm in Baltimore, where he lived in the most coarse and rustic manner. Totally secluded from all society, he conversed only with a few favorite authors and his dogs, until the year 1782, when, weary of his sequestered situation, he left his retreat and repaired to Philadelphia. But out of command, he found himself without friends, without respect, and so far from that independence congenial to his mind and to his years, that he was almost without the means of subsistence. In a short time, he sickened and died in obscurity, though in a city where he had been used to receive the highest marks of applause and respect. After the Battle of Monmouth, both parties boasted their advantages, as is usual after an indecisive action. It is certain Washington and his brave troops gained only honor and applause, while Sir Henry Clinton must have thought himself fortunate indeed. On the one hand, he escaped a pursuing army, and on the other, a fleet commanded by the Count d'Estaing, which had just arrived in the Chesapeake. Footnote: even the British themselves acknowledged that the Americans behaved with great spirit and intrepidity. In this action, a corps commanded by Colonel Dearborn acquitted themselves with such undaunted bravery that they attracted particular notice. A Southern officer of rank rode up to Mr. Dearborn and inquired who they were and to what portion of America that regiment belonged. The colonel replied in his laconic and soldierly manner, "Full-blooded Yankees, by God, sir, from the state of New Hampshire." End of footnote. The design of the French admiral was to shut up the British army in Philadelphia, but from the inclemency of the weather and contrary winds, a long passage prevented his arriving seasonably to effect so desirable an object. When Sir Henry Clinton left Philadelphia, he could scarcely expect or entertain a hope that he could conduct his army in safety through such an extent of country to their destination at New York. But after surmounting many embarrassments, he arrived there with his troops, nearly at the same time when the French squadron appeared at the entrance of the Delaware. It was a happy circumstance for Clinton that the Count d'Estaing did not at first direct his course to New York. However, within a few days after the arrival of the British troops, he appeared unexpectedly off Sandy Hook, and to the inexpressible mortification of British pride, they found themselves blocked up in their own harbor by the hereditary enemy of their nation. Old antipathies revived, irritation and resentment were wrought up to the highest pitch by new provocations, and nothing could exceed the indignation raised by the idea that the King of France was sending out his fleets and armies to aid and support the rebellious colonies. From the situation of the two fleets before New York, an engagement was thought by all to be inevitable. A spirit was diffused through all ranks of the Royal Army and Navy, expressive of the vigor, valor, and activity of British soldiers and seamen. Such was the popularity of Lord Howe, the importance of the cause, and their resentment towards France, that the soldiers, scarce recovered from their wounds and fatigue in the late action and retreat, were solicitous and impatient to face their Gallic enemy, and the British seamen in private service were equally emulous, and solicited eagerly and even contested the honor of employment in the navy. Prepared for action and confident of success, they ostentatiously boasted that the name of Howe and the terror of the British flag must intimidate Frenchmen in the moment of danger, as the recollection of former defeats would officiously obtrude, in spite of their most brilliant designs. This opinion was in some measure sanctioned by the inactivity of the Count d'Estaing, who, after lying 11 days without the smallest advance to action, left his station at Sandy Hook and proceeded northward. It is difficult to say whether the joy or the surprise of his enemies preponderated on this occasion. They justly considered it a very fortunate circumstance, as within 2 or 3 days 5 ships of the line belonging to Admiral Byron's squadron arrived singly in so shattered a condition that probably they, with the remainder of the fleet, must without a blow have fallen into the hands of the French, had they continued before New York. This unexpected maneuver of the Count was in consequence of a preconcerted plan that all naval operations should be suspended at the southward, and that with all possible dispatch the French fleet should repair to Rhode Island. This was in order to favor an expedition for the recovery of that beautiful spot, which had been seized, October 1776, and held by the British troops, now commanded by Sir Robert Pigot. There, under cover of a number of frigates, they had rested in safety nearly 2 years. Detachments from the army at Newport and its environs had frequently made incursions to the Main, burnt a part of the town of Bristol, and greatly annoyed both Providence and all the adjacent country. The Count d'Estaing arrived before Newport the 9th of August, and within a few days a large body of militia from the neighboring states, commanded by General Hancock, and a detachment of Continental troops under the command of General Sullivan, landed on the island. The American troops, healthy, active, and vigorous, flushed with the hope of victory, not only from their own spirit and bravery, but from expectations derived from the presence of their new allies, with a powerful naval force to aid their operations, were sanguine, confident, and impatient for action. But to their unspeakable disappointment, the very day on which they landed, the French fleet again put to sea, their commander having received intelligence that Lord Howe had left Sandy Hook in full force to engage him, and to prevent the dislodgment of the royal troops, who were strong and well fortified in every part of the island. Count d'Estaing judged it prudent to meet and fight the British squadron at sea, rather than suffer Lord Howe to make an effort to gain the harbor. His force was superior, his officers equally brave. There was a mutual ardor for engagement in the seamen, and a mutual ambition for glory in both the British and French commanders. But the unforeseen operations of nature that so often impede the designs of man again defeated the proud expectations of triumph in both parties. A severe storm that raged 48 hours separated the two fleets, and such was the violence of a gale scarcely paralleled in those seas, that Lord Howe, in a very shattered and broken condition, was obliged to repair to New York to refit, and the French commanders thought themselves happy to reach Boston in a very wretched and disabled state. The admiral's own ship was dismasted. The Caesar, of 74 guns, commanded by Monsieur de Boves, met the Isis, a British ship of war of only 50 guns. A sharp conflict ensued, but the Caesar having lost all her masts in the storm, darkness approaching, most of his men being slain and his own right arm shot off, Monsieur de Boves found it necessary to sheer off for Boston, where the whole fleet arrived in a few days. End of section 12.